everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 28th, where I wanted to continue talking about some short stories on A Rose for Emily. I also have what might seem to be a somewhat odd reading, Skim the Glossary of Literary Terms, and that's on page 1716 to 1739. I don't expect you to read the glossary, but I want you to know that it exists, and certainly I'll be using terms, and the textbook will be using terms throughout the course of the semester, and that this is a resource that you can utilize. And I also wanted to talk about our first formal writing assignment. So I'll begin with the writing assignment and then talk a little bit about reading and the writing process, since they both seem to go together, and then we could talk about A Rose for Emily. And you can see in the notes below, I've indicated that paper number 1 is going to be due by the 26th of October. The reason why I chose that date is because we are approximately halfway through the semester at that particular point. But I encourage early papers, and I have what I call a rolling deadline. So as soon as you've completed the paper, and at that point you can feel free to submit it in. If you haven't submitted it in by the 26th, I can certainly give you an extension, but I'm beginning to feel a bit anxious at that point because half of the semester would have been gone at that point. It is a critical paper, which means you shouldn't be using outside resources of about 4 to 5 pages, but as long as it needs to be ultimately for you to support your thesis. And you would be discussing a short story from the fiction section. Now, I've included the handout that I would have normally given you in class in the syllabus and other documents folder. And I suggest you might want to print it up just so that you've got a hard copy. I've got a hard copy here right in front of me. But I wanted to review that handout with you. And it's for the paper topics for our first section, fiction, short story. That, as I indicated, your paper is a critical paper, so you should not be consulting outside resources. This is based on your own thoughts and your own learning that occurs over class. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but ultimately as much or as little room as you need in order to be able to support your thesis. But 4 to 5 pages is a good guesstimate. You can choose any of the topics that I listed, and I listed 4, or you can write on your own topic. But if you do choose to write on your own topic, you want to make sure that you're having that topic approved with me beforehand, and it needs to be on one of the texts from the fiction section. So that would include A Sorrowful Woman, which we've already talked about, The Story of an Hour, which we've already talked about, A Rose for Emily, which we will be talking about today, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, Girl, and Popular Mechanics. That would put some closure onto our fiction section. So those are all of the pieces that we're reading in that particular section. So as you know, we began the semester by talking about canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of study. So I deliberately chose paper topic questions that require you to think, that don't require outside research, and that also don't necessarily have a right or a wrong answer. I'm more interested in your reasoning ability. So the first question is to identify a text from the fiction section that you think should be included in the literary canon, detailing the reasons why. And of course, the important piece is not identifying the text, it's your reasoning and making sure that you're making reference from the text in order to support your reasoning. Or number 2, identify a text from the fiction section that you think should not be included in the literary canon. Again, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study, detailing the reasons why. And again, you need to make references to the text. Or if you don't want to talk about canon, question number 3 is identify a text from the fiction section that you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. And again, the point is that while you do have to talk about our current society, you're really focusing on the text itself. Or number 4, identifying a text from the fiction section you think has the least contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. And again, the focus is on you addressing the text and what in the text would not be relevant. Regardless of the topic you choose, provide textual evidence and details to support your argument. And then in the bottom of this, I have a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? Unquote. And then I've got my parenthetical documentation in parentheses, author's last name, page number, close my parentheses, and then have my ending punctuation. This is from the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system, which we use for quoting in the humanities, including English and literature classes. And I'm hopeful this is something that you talked about in your previous English class, but we will also be discussing it over the next several weeks as well. And I had a very wise professor in college who once said that a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And I think that's true, that ultimately you could continue to improve your writing. So this quotation about, have you said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, is within the confines of the due dates, because obviously if you had years or months rather than weeks, you could do a much better job. The first paper is able to be revised. So once I review it and then I return it back to you, if you're content with your grade, you're done. But if you wanted to revise it for a higher grade, I ask that you incorporate my comments into your revision and certainly reach out to me if you need further direction, and that you hand in the revision, the new version, along with the original graded copy. You get the higher of the two grades. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do this, but the earlier the better for everybody involved. And your second paper is going to be addressing drama, which is the unit that follows short story. And that second paper basically is going to be due at the ending of the semester, so chances are you wouldn't have time to revise it. But again, it's another rolling deadline, so if you could get it in early enough, there's at least the possibility of negotiating, but we would have to negotiate. Everyone has the first paper guaranteed. The idea is that you've already gone through the process of learning how to write a paper with the first paper, so you're just duplicating that with a separate piece of literature. In this instance, it would be drama. So as the semester progresses, again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper. And as you know, there are introductory textbook readings that also talk about the conventions for writing a paper. I'm hopeful that by this point in the semester, you are able to get a copy of the textbook. As I had indicated, that I will be providing free links for you whenever I can, so that usually those free links are related to the literature itself. So these are the pieces of fiction that you would be having as options to write a paper about. So you can see that in the notes below, and underneath these videos I'll always include the class notes, which is basically what I would have been putting on a whiteboard in class if we were in a face-to-face class. So these are major points. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be doing the additional readings about how to write a paper and how to read literature that are included in the textbook that I can't find as free links online. But we had also discussed that you could do those after the fact, because I know that there were some challenges with getting textbooks, though I'm hopeful that by this point everybody has access to a textbook. And keep in mind that the books are also available on reserve in the GCC library. So what I wanted to do was to talk about Rose for Emily, and that was the short story that was assigned for today, pages 77 through 84, though I was able to find a link for it, as you can see. And I also wanted to talk about Faulkner's interview that occurs afterwards, Faulkner being the author of A Rose for Emily. And unfortunately, I was unable to find a link for that. That's on pages 84 through 56. And I also wanted to talk about reading and the writing process on page 1663. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a link for that either, but it's a good review of how to go about reading a text and ultimately writing about a text. And it talks about reading closely. I suggest 3 readings. The first just for plot, to understand what's happening. The second for analysis, to begin your interpretation, not just what's happening, but why are those things happening. And then finally, the last reading, which would be done immediately before a class or when you are writing about this particular piece. And the reason why is because you want to refresh your memory. though I am a realist and I understand that 3 readings might not necessarily be possible for you. And when you're reading, you want to make sure that you are either annotating, which means to take notes. You can do that in the margin of your readings. You've probably noticed that most textbooks have nice big white margins. You pay for that, by the way, through additional pieces of paper that are included in the text. But that's in order to help you. Though certainly you can annotate or write notes on a piece of paper or on a computer if you wanted to. And then it talks a little bit about choosing a topic, which is what you are in the midst, hopefully, of doing now that I have introduced some possible paper topics for you as well. And reading and the writing process, ultimately, whether you go about annotating something, basically taking your own notes on it, or you go about journaling, which is another way of responding to a text, but this time you're writing sentences and perhaps even paragraphs. But the journal's responses are just for your eyes only. You don't need to share them with anybody. So you don't need to worry about grammar or mechanics or even content. I personally like lists. As you can see, this is the way that I organize my own notes. What you see below these videos are literally my own notes. I've got them on hard copy, but of course I wanted to share those with you electronically. And then ultimately to go about writing, and once you've got these ideas in place, and rather than trying to write the perfect first sentence initially, which is usually a waste of time, to instead go through and generate ideas, and then you can begin to organize those ideas, and then you can begin to draft, and finally edit. And that's where you could try to make the perfect sentence, or as perfect as you can get it within the confines of the time limits that you have. So this is a very useful section, and it'll also talk a little bit about quotation because you will be expecting to quote. And again, I'm hopeful that this is review. And one of the things that you want to do is to try to determine when you are doing a reading what might be an important quote and why. Which is something actually that we will be discussing over the course of the semester. So, in terms of A Rose for Emily, the date in which it was written, because you want to begin by reading date 1931. This is going to be important in terms of giving us a time period. The story is set in the 1930s, and the setting is in the South. And this is also important because this would have been after the Civil War, but it was still a very delicate time politically with lots of tensions between the North and the South. And this will be important in terms of understanding the story. The story, written by William Faulkner, an author you might have heard of before, one of those great literary authors that are considered to basically be part of the literary canon, though certainly you can decide to question that if you so wanted to for this particular assignment, and that being the paper. Though, of course, you might want to defend that he should be part of the literary canon. The story itself is rather predictable, but the reason why it is perhaps confusing for readers and why readers aren't able to determine the twist ending is ultimately because of the chronology, the way in which the story is told, which is mixed. So you'll notice that we're not getting things in chronological order, which is important, because if we were to get things in chronological order, we could probably figure out the ending. So I can tell you the events in chronological order, and basically we're introduced to an Emily Grierson, who is part of a Southern aristocratic family from the Old South, and she has a domineering father, and her father does not allow her to date. And when her father passes away, she has a great difficulty accepting his death. She actually holds on to his body, his corpse, for 3 days until finally she is convinced to release it. By the way, insanity runs in her family, so perhaps that's also one of the reasons why she has such difficulty accepting the loss of her father. She disappears for a while, and then eventually she reemerges with a new appearance, new haircut, and basically she begins to date now that she has freedom because her father isn't there. And the person she dates is the exact opposite of anybody her father would approve of. Perhaps she does that on purpose. He happens to be a northerner. Remember that she's a southerner. and he's a laborer. She comes from Southern aristocracy, so there's a certain level of wealth and privilege that she comes from because of the history of slavery. And as she continues to date him, there's all kinds of speculation as to whether or not they are going to formalize their relationship and marry. And there's also references, albeit brief, that this is someone who would not make a commitment to Emily, that he liked men, actually, is what it said. And I think that's less a statement about his sexual orientation and more a statement about the fact of his wanting to embrace his bachelorhood and not being tied down. But regardless, again, the author doesn't want to give us his story. The author wants to give us Miss Emily's story instead. So in regardless of his motivation, he doesn't commit to her. And we know that ultimately, or he won't be committing to her. Ultimately, she's seen going to a druggist and buying some arsenic. She's supposed to indicate why she's buying that arsenic. She refuses to divulge that. The arsenic supplies the reason for rats. And then Homer is seen entering her home and is never seen again. And then a few days afterwards, this horrible stench comes from her home. The townspeople, they don't want to confront her, just like the druggist didn't want to confront her about why she was buying arsenic. So instead, they cover up the scent. And Miss Emily becomes a recluse for many, many years. And no one's really sure what she's doing. And then eventually, she passes away. And the entire town goes to her funeral, not because they're concerned about Miss Emily, but really they're interested in being able to visit her home afterwards. Because, again, she's been a recluse for many years. And they go to her home and they find a locked room. They open that locked room. And what they find in that locked room is the corpse of her former boyfriend, Homer Barron. The assumption is that she killed him because he wouldn't commit to her in a relationship. And perhaps you might have already figured out that ending, even with the mixed chronology. Again, learning that Homer disappears first and then learning about the scent afterwards. Or I should say the other way around, learning about the scent first and then learning that Homer disappears afterwards helps to confuse the reader, which is why it's important to put things in chronology in order to understand the story. But in the event, if you were able to anticipate the ending, you probably weren't able to anticipate the second twist ending, which is that there was an iron gray hair lying next to the corpse. This is an important detail because Miss Emily's hair turns gray years after Homer's disappearance, which means that she was lying next to the corpse years after Homer's disappearance. And what she was doing with that corpse, we're not told. But anything your imagination can provide, I'm sure, is much more graphic and disturbing than anything that the author could have provided. And that said, the story is written in a particular style called Southern Gothic. You may be familiar with the Gothic style, which started in the 1800s and led to texts such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, something that we cover actually in my Gothic literature class, where there are decrepit castles and there are mysteries and there's darkness and decay, possible supernatural elements, so forth and so on. Well, this convention of the Gothic, which began in England, eventually was picked up in New England, which was the England that was new in the United States, with individuals that you've probably heard of before, such as Edgar Allan Poe, who would oftentimes write in that tradition, setting being all important, though Poe would emphasize the psychological emphasis of horror. And then there were a group of authors from the American South who began writing in this style and setting their stories in the American South. This is known as Southern Gothic, and this is what William Faulkner does with his story, A Rose for Emily. In fact, if you know anything about William Faulkner, he comes from the South. His family, his ancestors had been involved in slavery. He was quite ashamed of that, and he was quite troubled by that, so he oftentimes talks about the ugly history of slavery and its legacy in his works, which is usually how this story is read, that it could be seen as formulaic, much like A Secret Sorrow, that is very predictable, that you have a spurned lover who basically kills her lover so that she can keep him forever. The mixed chronology hides that ending, which could be formulaic, but more importantly, the story is usually read from a symbolic perspective. And I've even given you the author's interview afterwards where it talks a little bit about some of the symbolism. But we could begin with something like the symbolism of the title, A Rose for Emily. Roses come with lots of imagery. Usually people think about something like a rose representing a flower, and roses are oftentimes given as memorials for things like funerals, which is how this story begins, Miss Emily's funeral. Or perhaps roses are also given as tokens of love, and this is definitely a thwarted love story, so perhaps that's significant. You think about the physical appearance of a rose. It's delicate with petals, but it also has thorns. In other words, it can hurt. And when we think about Miss Emily, she definitely has the ability to hurt. After all, she murders her lover. Thinking just about the color, most people will probably envision a red rose. And there are all kinds of associations with red, whether red is associated with passion, and definitely this was a crime of passion, or red is associated with blood, and certainly the legacy of slavery and the generational legacy of it is something that we can think of in terms of blood. We can also think about blood as being something that's associated with violence, and certainly murder is violent and bloody, or can be bloody. Roses are sometimes even kept as mementos. They can be dried and even pressed, so they can be kept forever for as a memory. And one might say that's exactly what Miss Emily does with Homer. She dries him out, in effect, and keeps him as a memento. Rose also is a color. It's a mix of red and white. So, it's not the extreme of red or white. White perhaps representing purity, and red perhaps representing the exact opposite of purity. And perhaps we might say that this story, too, is a mix of extremes. And rose is also a verb from the verb rise, but rose in the past tense. This was a convention of Southern aristocracy to rise when somebody of status and power, especially female, walked into a room. Someone like a Grierson, which is what Emily is, from an old Southern aristocratic family. And that said, there's lots of ways that you could interpret the title, and yet the author's interview, he's asked point blank, what is the significance of the title? And I think his response is quite interesting, where he basically doesn't answer the question at all. He just says that it's a rose for Emily. And when he's asked, what's the meaning of the title Rose for Emily? His response is, it's simply the poor woman had no life at all. Her father had kept her more or less locked up. She had a lover who was about to quit her. She had to murder him. It was just a rose for Emily, that's all. I'm rather disappointed in that answer, and it's one of the reasons why I actually offer this interview, that it is possible for us to disagree even with the author. The interview was done decades after the story was written, so that's a piece to consider. How much did the author remember? Or was the author being deliberately flippant, refusing to give us an answer, having us work for it? The author was known for also liking his drink, and we don't even know what kind of state he was in, sober or not sober, when he gave this interview. In the end, though, it doesn't matter. I use this as an illustration that even the author could have a perspective on their own work. And as long as we have evidence from the text to support another perspective, that's valid. In effect, we're all attorneys, and we've been given the details of a case, if you will. And a good attorney can argue either prosecution or defense. Same details, but of course they're focusing on different pieces of evidence. Of course, one side might have more evidence than another, but a good lawyer would be able to prove one side more than another, regardless of the evidence that exists or doesn't exist. And that's basically what you're doing with a paper. And continuing on with this analogy, I guess you could think of me as the judge, where I'm supposed to remain unbiased, regardless of my own personal opinion. And it's based on the case itself that you present as to whether or not you've persuaded me. And I can say that if Faulkner handed in a paper that was 3 or 4 lines long that responded to the meaning of the title, Rose for Emily, and the way he did in his interview, he wouldn't earn a very good grade at all. Particularly since I've suggested that we could think of roses as flowers, and imagine devoting a paragraph to each of the elements associated with flower, and color, and verb, And we'd probably have a good 4 to 5 page paper there once we worked our way down. That said, that's a 4 to 5 double space paper. That's the convention. If you were to take away the double spacing, that would be about a 2 page paper. When you think about it, that's not that long, especially when you have an introduction and a conclusion. That's going to take up space. But I don't in any way negate the effort and time that it takes to come up with a 4 to 5 page double space paper, even if it is reduced to 2 pages when you remove the double spacing. But of course, you would submit it with the double spacing. That's where teachers add their comments, by the way. So that said, the paper would be submitted in via PDF to my email. That's how my email program works best. And then I would return that back to your email just so that you could see my commentary. And everybody has the option of rewriting it. And you can hand in the paper at any point, but I suggest you might want to wait until we have talked about the text that you are thinking about writing about your paper on. By the time the paper date comes up, we would have read all of the text in the fiction section. And that said, as I indicated, I'll also be talking about some of the conventions of writing a paper, but that's also included in your textbook readings. So, there's a good amount of foreshadowing in this text. Foreshadowing are just hints or clues about what will be occurring. And we don't really appreciate foreshadowing until we get the ending of the text. And again, the foreshadowing is a mixed chronology. But the fact that there's insanity in the family, the fact that Emily has a domineering father, the fact that she denies her father's death for 3 days. In fact, there's an episode there where we're told that she doesn't pay taxes. And part of the reason why is because after her father's death, while she still has family status, the family doesn't have money anymore. So she can't afford to pay her taxes. And rather than the town confronting her about her inability to do so, which could be embarrassing and uncomfortable, they create the story that her father had lent the town money, and the town now owes money to the family, and the way they're repaying it is by forgiving her taxes. And it's all a lie. It's something that Colonel Sators comes up with, where we're told that, basically only a man of his generation, someone from old school Southern aristocracy, could have thought of it, and only a woman could have believed it. So there's lots of racism, sexism, classism elements within this text, including the use of the N-word, which is quite problematic. But if you think about the time in which this text was written, it gives us a sense of the historical period and what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. But the fact that even after Colonel Sators dies, Miss Emily cannot accept the fact that he's dead, and when the new generation wants their taxes, she directs them to see Colonel Sators, even though he's been dead for years. So this goes to show that, again, she has trouble accepting death. Might I suggest she lives in a dead past. And the idea of her, of course, killing and keeping Homer's corpse. Her buying arsenic, and I always chuckle over the fact that the merchant writes rat poison for the reason for purchasing that arsenic. One might perhaps say that Homer is a rat for having a relationship with Miss Emily but not committing to her. Of course, Homer disappears. After the disappearance, we get information about the smell, so we can put all the clues together, and that she's become a recluse. But outside of the plot, which could be viewed as formulaic if it were put in chronological order, I think the more interesting way to read the story is about Miss Emily living in a dead past, as I had suggested. That she is part of old school Southern aristocracy that earned its wealth and its power through the brutalities and horrors of slavery. And that, yes, while slavery has been eliminated, that doesn't mean that racism has been eliminated. And of course, the person that she chooses, Homer Barron, if she represents Southern aristocracy, Homer Barron represents the New North, and they earn their money through labor. Though, of course, we can talk about some of the robber barons during the time period who basically were stealing the labor of others by paying substandard wages, and that still exists in terms of economic inequality in our own society. Miss Emily does not have a slave. Those times are past, but she does have a servant. His story would be fascinating to find out. He barely speaks and he disappears as soon as she dies. But we're not given that story. Faulkner gives us Miss Emily's story. And in addition to showing how she continues to live in the past, she's trying to teach China painting, which no one is interested in anymore, the new generation. She writes in calligraphy, which is an old-fashioned style of writing. She refuses free postal delivery. Perhaps something comparable might be not accepting high-speed internet. And, even the house that she lives in is decaying and decrepit, which represents her and perhaps represents the old Southern lifestyle of decay and the idea of no longer being applicable to the new expectations of society. That said, you may or may not have noticed the narration of this story, that we are told this story in the we. This is the community telling the story. And in many ways, we learn much more about the community than we do about Miss Emily. They come off as being very unpleasant, very unattractive, very gossipy, very much in awe of Miss Emily, but also very much happy at her misfortune. The only modern day parallel I can think of is how perhaps we as fans might respond to celebrity, that we are fans and we emulate, but we also take perhaps a certain perverse pleasure in their difficulties. At one point when Miss Emily buys that arsenic, there's speculation that she's going to commit suicide with it. No one intervenes. No one tries to help. Instead, they sit back and they watch, almost as if it's entertainment, which I think says a great deal about this community. And again, the fact that they're going to a funeral more out of curiosity. They even reference her as a kind of fallen monument. I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be thought of as a fallen monument after I've passed away. But this we community is central to the text because we never really get Miss Emily's story from Miss Emily's perspective. And I suspect we would get a very different kind of story from Miss Emily's perspective if she were to give it. So, again, what we learn about this society is through this we community and how they treat Miss Emily. And to go back to the Faulkner interview and some of the other questions that he's asked, for instance, that since it's been argued that a rose for Emily could be a criticism of the North, if Homer represents the North, and if it could be said that the story is a criticism of the South, Miss Emily represented the South, could it be said that the story is really just a criticism of its times? And this is what Faulkner responds with. Now that I don't know, because I was simply trying to write about people. The writer uses environment, what he knows. And if there's a symbolism to which the lover represents the North, and the woman who murdered him represents the South, I don't say that's not valid and not there. But there was no intention of the writer to say, now let's see. I'm going to write a piece in which I will use a symbolism for the North and another symbol for the South. That he was simply writing about people, a story which he thought was tragic and true, because it came out of the human heart, the human aspiration, the conflict of conscience with glands, with the old Adam. It was a conflict not between North and South so much as, well, between God and Satan. And then the question is just a little bit more on that one thing. You say it's a conflict of God and Satan. I don't quite understand what you mean. I remember when I first read this interview and I felt the same way. I don't understand. Did you mean that did one represent and this is Faulkner's answer. The conflict was in Miss Emily. She knew you don't murder people. She had been trained you don't take a lover. You marry, you don't take a lover. She had broken all the laws of her tradition, her background, and broken the law of God too. And again, I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of Faulkner's perspective here. Notice how when Faulkner's answering this question, he refers to himself in the third person in the we, which I always find somewhat eyebrow-raising as well. But I give you this interview if for no other reason for you to understand the idea that the author might have a perspective, but that doesn't necessarily preclude you from having another, as long as there's evidence in the text to support what it is that you happen to be arguing. And as I talked about in terms of some of the ways that you could go about reading a piece of literature, one of the things that you could do is identify important quotes, and that those quotes can help formulate some ideas that you might have for possible analysis, let's say for a paper. That's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, is I am going to ask you to identify a quote that is important to you and Miss Emily and talk about the reasons why. So notice there is no right or wrong answer in the sense that this is opinion based. What do you feel is an important quote in Miss Emily? And then, of course, to talk a little bit about why you feel it's an important quote. And this will be due 48 hours from today if you're watching this on Thursday. That would be Saturday the 30th. But obviously, the sooner you hand this in, the better. And certainly, if it turns out that you needed to you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it for you. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses. And my responses in turn, as you can see that I respond to everything you write, I read everything that you write. And that said, that's where we're going to pick up next class. Is we'll talk a little bit about quotation with Miss Emily, or a Rose for Emily, I should say. And then we have 3 stories that are coming up, so we're moving up the pace a little bit. Luckily, I was able to find all 3 links for these 3 short stories: Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that these stories not only are part or could be considered part of the canon. You might disagree. And again, if you wanted to write about that, you could talk about the reasons why you don't think they should be part of the canon, or why they do or they don't have relevance in our contemporary society. And also talking a little bit about other possible paper topics that you could pursue. Again, you're encouraged to write on your own paper topic, but you do need to have the topic approved by me, and it does have to be on one of the texts that we are studying in this particular section. Your second paper, which won't be due till the ending of the semester, will be on drama, our next unit. And since it's due at the ending, I don't think you would have time to revise, but it's a rolling deadline, as I had indicated. So with both the first and the second paper, if you could get in that second paper early enough, perhaps we can negotiate about a revision, but it's not guaranteed. Certainly the first paper is guaranteed for everybody, and you have up until the last day of class, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. So I'm curious to see what quotes you will identify as important in A Rose for Emily. And then next class, we will put some closure on Rose for Emily, and we will talk about 3 short stories, which is Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. So you can see that we've fallen behind with our schedule, but we will be catching up eventually. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.